very much that you found a moment to spend this hour with me. It's a great pleasure to meet you and to be able to speak to you about the places that I personally love, personally interested in. And today we are going to visit Dagestan, which is the south of Russia. And before we go to my presentation, before we go to the map, I want to start with a short video. It's not a very good quality because it was filmed on the telephone on the wedding. It's the video with the dance. You will see the mountain Jews of Dagestan that we're going to speak about dancing. And the reason I'm showing you this video in a second is because this dance, this very traditional dance of the mountain Jews from Dagestan, the males dance, is something which represents this culture better than anything else, that shows the personality of mountain Jews better than any of the explanations. So before we go to the details, the history and heritage and the maps and the photographs, let me show you this short video. Here we go. So today we're going to speak about Jews who have been living in the mountains of Caucasian region for a very, very long time, and who adopted much of the culture of their surrounding people. And this dance that we saw represents the idea that we will go over and over again, the idea of Jews of this region being very masculine, and a Jewish man of this region is supposed to be able to dance, to shoot, to fight, to ride horse, and represent that masculine idea. In Russian language, mountain sounds like gora, and so mountain Jews are gorskie. Even today, when mountain Jews live all over the world, and you find their communities here in Israel, and you find them in the United States and so many places, they still use this word gorskie Yevrei, which means mountain Jews, to represent themselves. It's their very important identity. It's very traditional community where children are being taught with the traditional language and the dance and the music and songs, where they cook traditional food. So let's see where these Jews come from, who they are, what is so specific and unique about them. This is the map of the region. Here is Russia, this is Ukraine, Moldova, Turkey, down here would be Iran. There's Black Sea on the left, Caspian Sea on the right. During our four-part series, we have been to Georgia and spoke about Georgian Jews. It's the east of Caucasus Mountains. We've been to Azerbaijan and spoke about Ashkenazi and mountain Jews of Azerbaijan. It's west of Caucasus Mountains. on the shore of Caspian Sea. We traveled further to the Central Asia to speak about Uzbekistan and the Jews of Bukhara. And now we are on the territory of Russia. It's this southern border of Russia, this territory which borders Azerbaijan and Georgia, this one, and it's called Dagestan. You may know its neighbor better because its neighbor is Chechnya. That's where Russia had a long-term war in the early and mid-90s. So that's Dagestan, and that's Chechnya here. All this area to the, it's the northern part of Caucasus Mountains. Historically, they were Jews in this area, and all of them were named as mountain Jews. It's the name which was artificially given to them by the Russian administration in the early 19th century, but it worked well. It worked well. It was adopted by Jews, and today mountain Jews proudly use it, showing their difference, showing that they are a specific type of Jews. Dagestan basically means the land of mountains, and it's true. Now there are no more than 1,700 Jews living in Dagestan. Absolute majority of mountain Jews left Russia, and now you find them mainly in Israel, United States, and Canada. Some also live in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So, for example, in 1992, there were over 20,000 Jews in this tiny region. We will mainly visit this town called Derbent. It's like unofficial capital of the mountain Jews. If you remember our talk about Azerbaijan, so this is the border with Azerbaijan, and in Azerbaijan we visited Kuba, that Jewish village of Azerbaijan. So the very close connections between Derbent and Kuba Jews, though they don't like each other. Jews of Dagestan consider Jews of Azerbaijan as being very much about money, but not educated. Jews of Azerbaijan consider Jews of Dagestan not to be a little poor and out of fashion. So it's fun that the Jews having absolutely the same culture still can be very, very different. If not for the current political situation in Russia and the war Russia is, the war which is going on between Russia and Ukraine, Dagestan could have been a perfect travel destination. It's beautiful. They're beautiful mountains. The gorgeous rivers. There are incredible views. There's very innocent, untouched beauty of the nature. One can travel, one can hike. There are absolutely incredible cave towns built so long ago on the hills of the mountains. There are all different options for traveling. Historical monuments, forts, old castles, and woods and rivers, everything. But of course, now there is nearly no incoming tourism in Russia. So Dagestan now is one of the places that Russian people love to visit, love to travel. It's incredibly interesting history and lots of unusual and unique monuments. Many parts of Dagestan, when we look at the old photographs, we see that they haven't changed much. Dagestan was never wealthy. It's not a wealthy region. It's been quite poor, let's say 100 to 200 years ago. Today, it's getting better and better, but most of its history, Dagestan was, it was the region where people had to live at the edge, and it concerns Jews specifically. These are very typical homes that people in Dagestan usually built. Jews used to live in exactly the same houses. It's called sakla. If you look at the photograph, you will see that it's like one house, but then there is another one built on top of it, on the roof. it already belongs to somebody else. And then another one, you build it this way if you have to live on the slope of the mountain. And mountain Jews of Dagestan used to live exactly in such homes. Up to today, you can find the whole towns built in this way. This is the traditional costume of the people living in Dagestan. Although it's a relatively small territory, it's populated by lots of different, like, tiny nations. They're tiny different nations. Every national group, every ethnic group would have its own specific, like, type of food, specific, slightly different language, specific costume. But like here, there are 5 different men. They're dressed similar, but different because they represent different ethnic groups of Dagestan. But all of them are Muslim. And as you can see, what's common, they have those fur hats, and they're dressed as warriors. Being a warrior was the main value in this region for hundreds of years. This region had to go through hundreds and hundreds of local wars. There were constant fights between those ethnic groups, between the leaders of the ethnic groups. And Jews very often fell victims of those wars. What we know today about the history of Mountain Jews, what we know about the culture of Mountain Jews of the past, is thanks to this man. His name is Joseph Chorny. Chorny means black, in fact. He's a Jew. He was born in the middle of the 19th century in Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, one of the countries that I would like to take you on a virtual tour. And he was born in a normal Jewish family, but he became, after he finished his education, he became a traveler and ethnographer. And it's Joseph Chorny who arrived in Caucasian region, and he was probably one of the first Ashkenazi Jews who met Mountain Jews, who met the Jews of this region. And he started his study. He took lots of interviews. He wrote a specific diary observing daily routine of the surrounding Jews. At first, he thought that he met 10 lost tribes of Israel. And it's interesting that Mountain Jews also had this legend that they were the descendants of the 10 lost tribes. There was no evidence for that. But at the end of the 19th century, in the circle of Jewish intellectuals of the Russian Empire, it was a very popular idea that because the Jews of the shtetls are not really are not any similar to the Jews of the ancient Israel, we shall go and find those ideal, right, correct Jews, Jews that would remind us of those warriors of the ancient Israel. So lots of Jewish intellectuals from the western part of Russia were very much interested in going to Caucasus to study the life and traditions and customs of the Mountain Jews. Mountain Jews speak specific language, Jewry, and it's a life language. Even today, when they live outside of that mountain region, they still use this language at home. They teach their kids with this language. They have songs. It's a life language. It's a form of Persian mixed with Hebrew. Alphabet was originally Hebrew, then changed to Latin, then changed to Cyrillic, which is Russian, as part of the Soviet, specific Soviet cultural program towards the national minorities. See, these photographs, they show the way Western Jews, like the Jews from a western part of Russian Empire, wanted to see mountain Jews. They wanted to see mountain Jews as those great warriors with swords, with guns, strong and ready to fight. To be honest, it's a picture. The reality was very, very different. In reality, most of mountain Jews were very poor and were living a very, very, very difficult life, not speaking about the fact that there were certain laws restricting them, for example, from riding a horse. In Dagestan, in that mountain, in the area of Caucasus Mountains, Jews did not have specific economical niche, like something that is familiar to us when we speak about Eastern Europe. We all know in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Lithuania, then in Russian Empire, Jews were middlemen, Jews were people of towns. We know it very well. Here in this region, there was no some specific economical niche for Jews. Many of them were involved in agriculture. Some of them were involved with peddling or some small crafts. There's no something that we can say, this is the unique role of Jews in this society. Mountain Jews were very, you can say, conservative in a way of they got stuck to the Jewish tradition, even though the Jewish knowledge was not very strong, because mountain Jews had been living isolated for a very long period of time. So for a long time, they did not have access to the vast Jewish knowledge. But when it comes to to observing every single tradition, yes, all the rules had to be observed. They were given from the mother to the daughter, from the father to the son, and the families followed the tradition. Lots of customs were absorbed from the surrounding Muslims. For example, whatever concerns family life, the relations between men and women, boys and girls, the arranged marriages, all other things about it, it was very much absorbed from the surrounding Muslims. Interesting thing is that living isolated from most of the Jews in the world, mountain Jews developed their own names for the holidays. So, for example, Pesach would be called Nisono because it's in the month, because of the month Nisan. Purim would be Omono, probably after Aman. Shavuot is still called Asalta, which means sweet, because for Shavuot, it's a lot of sweet pies. What we know for sure is that mountain Jews are considered to be the descendants of Jewish migrants who were constantly going from the south to the north, from what's now northern Iran to the Caucasus Mountains, so to Azerbaijan, and then further north to Dagestan. This immigration probably started together with Muslim conquest of the region in about 7th century and definitely continued and at least until 13th century. So to the most of the historians, it's clear that mountain Jews have that Persian origin, that the closest connection would be with the Persian Jews. Mountain Jews themselves have lots of legends explaining how exactly they arrived here, who they are. There is a legend about 10 lost tribes. There is, for example, belief that mountain Jews are the descendants of Esther and Mordecai, and it makes Purim a especially important holiday for the mountain Jews. There is another legend that says that at the time of Darius II of Persia, which is 5th century before our era, Jews were told by the king, those who accept my faith can stay in Baghdad, those who do not must go. So Jews who did not want to change their faith scattered about the mountains of the Caucasus. And that is why Jews are called mountain Jews. It's a very interesting legend thinking about the fact that this name mountain Jews was artificially given very late, only in the 19th century, but Jews then later found a specific explanation for it. We know about the presence of Jews in the Caucasian region thanks to different non-Jewish sources. For example, 13th century Flemish missionary and explorer, traveler, William of Rubruck. He traveled quite a lot along Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea, passing Caspian Sea and further to Asia, and he spoke about a large number of Jews that he saw and met in the area of Caucasian Mountains. There is some Egyptian historian of 15th century that spoke about Jews from Caucasus visiting Cairo. That's another evidence. There is a traveler from Netherlands who visited the territory of modern Dagestan in the late 17th century and also spoke about 15,000 Jews, meaning he saw them everywhere. So we understand for a certain period of time, it was a large community. What else we know? We know that there was a specific valley not far from here, not too far from Derbent here. There was a valley between mountains. They were about it was called Jehut Kata, meaning Jewish valley. By the way, Jewry, the name of the language, means Jewish language. There were at least 7 Jewish villages, and they were surrounded with they surrounded the main one, the capital, Abu Saba. So it was like a whole Jewish settlement there. It definitely existed in 17th, 18th centuries. Jews preserved legends of their presence in that particular valley, basically since Babylonian times. What happened afterwards in the late 18th century of the first day of Passover, 1797, Abu Saba was destroyed. It was attacked by some neighboring Muslims. They murdered all men that they managed to find. They raped women. They took women and children to the slavery. And those Jews who survived in the surrounding villages, they ran to Derbent. And so in the late 18th century, that's how Derbent, this town on the shore of Caspian Sea, became that unofficial Jewish capital. Jews had to run there trying to save their lives. This case is one of many. In this region, for many centuries, it was not an exception to go and murder Jews. It was part of norm, part of everyday life. The Jewish cemetery, Jews come to Derbent in 1797, but the Jewish cemetery in Derbent was established only 7 years later. Now there are over 37,000 tombs in Derbent. Some of them are really, really old ones, and it's more and more difficult to take care of them because there are fewer and fewer Jews in Derbent. What about those 7 years? First 7 years, Jews were not allowed to bury anybody in Derbent, so they had to bring the dead bodies back to that Jewish valley and bury them there at night so nobody could see them. In the early 19th century, Russian Empire came to this region, to the region of Caucasus Mountains, and there was Russian-Persian War. As a result of that war, the territory of modern Dagestan was annexed by Russian Empire. Russia created here this so-called mountain principality, mountain region, and named all people who lived here as mountain people, no matter what specific ethnic or religious group they originally were. That's how we receive mountain Jews. It's the name given by the Russian administration. That annexation was followed by a uprising. It was an uprising that started in Chechnya here, where you see Grozny in this area, and covered all of this territory of northern Caucasus. Uprising of 1830s, 1850s, led by Imam Shamil. Imam Shamil, whose portrait you see on the left, is a big hero in Chechen and Dagestan tradition, and anti-hero in the Jewish tradition, of course. Very similar story with Bogdan Khmelnytsky in Ukraine. Whenever you have this uprising to defend national interests, Jews fall victims of it. During his uprising, he almost created a theocratic Muslim state. And he started the war not only against Russians, but also against all non-Muslims. So from the recordings made by Yosef, and you can say Yuda Chordy, that famous ethnographer, we learn that during that period, Jews had no synagogues or prayer houses left. Only on Saturdays, they gathered in some big barn where they prayed in a low voice without loud chants, because if the Muslims found out that the Jews had gathered for prayer, they broke in there, insulted and beat the worshippers, and then burned this house. So for Jews of this era, it was incredibly dark, incredibly difficult, nearly impossible time to survive. At the same time, Russian government realized that they could rely on Jews. The Jews could be support for them. So Russian government had some mountain Jews in their army, and they granted such Jews with Russian citizenship, some good amount of money. So for Jews, if for Jews in the western part of Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, Russian government was always an sort of enemy. Here, Russian government was an ally. It was the only help against Muslim terror, and Jews. Russian government started building forts, military forts, and Jews would run into those forts, asking to let them in, would populate those forts and serve in the Russian army. Imam Shamil also had Jews in his army. They were mountain. They were some Ashkenazi Jews fighting on his side for their own reasons. We know for sure that he had some of the close confidence that the head of his mint, that his personal doctor may be his favorite wife. There are different opinions about that. They were Jews. So it was a very complicated political and military situation, but for a majority of Dagestan Jews, it was a very, very, very hard time to survive, to save their lives. These are some photographs of mountain Jews. See, once European Jews saw mountain Jews, they always wanted them to be photographed, in those nice costumes. And at the same time, see, as soon as mountain Jews were able to serve in the Russian army, for them, it was a great honor, because before that, they were not allowed to carry swords. They were not allowed to ride horses. Now, Russian army gave them this opportunity, actually somehow putting them higher up on the same level with Muslims. So they started wearing this uniform with great pride. And in general, the tradition of mountain Jews is to give the highest respect to anybody involved in military, to anyone with military experience. This is a very popular postcard of the early 20th century. I shall tell you that this is photo montage. These two men, these are real delegates, two delegates from the mountain Jews that participated in the Fourth Zionist Congress in the 1900s, but they were never photographed together with Theodor Herzl. It's photo montage. This postcard became incredibly popular among Jews. It's very interesting that Zionist ideas were brought into this area only in the late 19th century after the first Zionist Congress, but they became incredibly popular. And we see how immediately the wealthiest mountain Jews wanted to go and make Aliyah and settle in the land of Israel. And we see those first families resettling, like a family who managed to buy a piece of land near Ramla, and they built a settlement Ber Yaakov in 1907, several families going to Jerusalem, and somewhere in 1909 there were 64 families settling in Jerusalem. So the Zionist ideas, as soon as they arrived in Caucasus region, they became incredibly popular and influential. On the left photograph, this is what we see on most of the photographs. A man dressed in this military uniform. Don't be surprised that there are two women with him and children. Mountain Jews had no restrictions on polygamy, so many of them, I mean, those who could afford it, had two wives, sometimes three. It was normal. But that's the reality on the right photograph. Absolute majority of mountain Jews lived below the edge of poverty and had to survive in a very harsh economical conditions. They lived, and some lived in very poor houses, some similar to what you see in the photographs. Others basically lived in caves, like holes in the ground with roofs made of branches coated with clay mixed with small stones. The caves that rise a little bit above the ground. So there is a small hole that serves as a window, of course, without glass. And so the sun hardly makes its way to this cave. It was very, very, very poor life, the life where you don't build a house, where you don't have much property, where you need to hide, where you are always ready to run away, saving your life. Most of the jobs of the mountain Jews, first of all, it was agriculture, it was viticulture, making wine. It was also the cultivation of tobacco. It was fishing, work with leather, what Muslims hated because of the smell, shoemaking, winemaking, peddling, soap production. Some lucky ones were able to start some business selling carpets in Derbent. No more than 14% of mountain Jews were involved in any type of commerce, from peddling to big businesses, which makes them very different from Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe or Western Europe. This is a madder. It's this flower. From the roots of this flower, it needs to grow at least 3 years until it gets proper roots. And then from its roots, you can make a very important red dye. For centuries, it was the only source of red dye for fabric. So lots of mountain Jews, they cultivated madder. Until in 1869, German chemists synthesized artificial alizarin, which was produced industrially from 1871, and it means that the chemical artificial red dye was produced, and it ended up the business of mountain Jews, and many of them got bankrupted and had to start their life over again, trying to find some other economical niche. In general, economical situation of mountain Jews was incredibly difficult. See, they did not have their own land. So they had to rent plots of land from the local landlords, who were, of course, Muslims. Jews had to pay rent, plus they had to perform labor duties for the landlord, plus they had to pay a special tax established for all non-Muslims, plus they have to give away part of their harvest. Finally, there was very little that they could make. There was very little that they were able to sell, and very little that they could preserve for themselves. Plus, it's per person. But plus to that, the Jewish community had to pay special community tax, usually with different goods. More of it. So you have a village where Jews live, and then there is a landlord who owns it. So Jews have to supply the landlord with whatever he needs. He needs clothes, shoes, horses, donkeys. They bring it. If there is an event, for example, a wedding at landlord's house, that's the end of the day, bika, or birth of a child, or a guest arrives, then Jewish community has to provide additional services and additional goods and additional money. So they were never sure about their tomorrow. There was no certainty. There was no feeling of a safety. There were lots of duties that Jews had to provide to the landlord: to repair his house, to fix his roof for winter, to fix the fence, to remove snow in winter, to deliver firewood, and so on and so on. Also, they were obliged to do some, non-respectful and manual work, some humiliating work, like, for example, the manual clearer, to emphasize their lower position compared to Muslims. So it was very, very, very poor life without any feeling of security that tomorrow, that the feeling that you can expect something nice tomorrow. Many women were involved in some small trading, because if Muslim women wanted to buy something, they could only buy it from women visiting their homes. Again, looking at this photograph, as you already know, a man, two wives. A man who had at least some money could afford having 2 or sometimes 3 months. Usually within the territory of the Jewish village, women did not have to cover their faces, except for the fact if it was young girl who happened to be outdoors, which was very unusual. After the age of 12, girls were not, let's say, recommended to be outside. And she saw a young man. She had to immediately sit at the ground and cover her face with some handkerchief or something, or shawl. Also, if by chance Jewish women were in some area outside Jewish village, they covered their faces not to be seen by Muslims, just for their own safety. Late 19th, early 20th century, Ashkenazi Jews from the western regions of Russia started coming to Dagestan. They were soldiers and their families, and they were Jewish migrants from the Pale of Settlement. See, after the pogroms of 1881, 1905, Jews of Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, they were looking for some options, where to go, where to run. Many found their way to America. Some made Aliyah to the land of Israel. Some found it's convenient to go to Siberia. We spoke about it in our talk about Siberian Jews. And some found their way to the east of Russia, to the Caucasian region, and further to the Caucasian region, and further to the Central Asia. Those Ashkenazi Jews coming to Dagestan were absolutely shocked, seeing the traditions of mountain Jews, seeing those polygamy, seeing mountain Jews not having any schools, not giving their children any proper Jewish education. So they started the process of opening schools, traditional yeshivas, and new modernized schools. So the Jewish education was somehow recreated, restarted in Dagestan in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is, for example, here on the left, the photograph of the first Russian Jewish school for boys and girls opened in Derbent in 1904. This is the board of the school. As you can see, there are few mountain Jews here. The majority are Ashkenazi Jews from the western part of Russian Empire. There were, of course, some spiritual leaders among mountain Jews, like Yaakov Itzhaki. His father managed to go to study in yeshiva in Lithuania and came back and opened a first Orthodox style yeshiva in Derbent. And so Yaakov Yitzhak, he continued the tradition of his father. He went to study in yeshiva in Ukraine. He became chief rabbi for Mountain Jews. He wrote first Jewry Hebrew dictionary. And finally, in 1907, together with some other members of his family and a big group of Mountain Jews, he made Aliyah, and that group built Ber Yaakov, named after him, near Ramla. The revolution of 1917 and the civil war in Dagestan. It was a very hard time, and that's the period when Jews finally left all the small villages and run into the towns to escape from the pogroms. So even more Jews arrived in Derbent. Unlike Ashkenazi Jews in the western part of Russia, here, Mountain Jews did not really actively participate in the revolution, mainly because absolute majority of them were illiterate and did not really understand what was going on. They were not politically active. That whole process that was going on in the western part of Russia hasn't arrived here, hasn't touched this area. But many joined the Red Army during the Civil War. Remember, it's honorable to be in the army, and since this opportunity was offered, they were happy to accept it. We see that in that time, there were more and more different Jewish political parties becoming active in the region, so especially Zionists. They even managed to publish the newspaper in Jewry. And we see it's the time when some new institutions were formed, like, for example, we see a Congress of Mountain Jews. So slowly, step by step, Mountain Jews wanted to become more and more politically active. In general, speaking about this area, during the Civil War, most of the big cities were badly destroyed, economy was devastated, and the general population, not speaking about Jews specifically, but the general, decreased for about 20%. It was not a very wealthy region, and it became even poorer. So after the revolution, it becomes Soviet Dagestan. And it's interesting. See, Soviet government had different approach to Ashkenazi and non-Ashkenazi Jews. And so here in Dagestan, all Ashkenazi synagogues were closed. But the synagogues of Mountain Jews remained open because Mountain Jews were treated as aborigines, as some local tribes, as local ethnic group whose culture has to be supported by the government. It's period of a very active emancipation of Jews. It was general policy of Soviet Union it was called Let's Liberate Women of the East. So they forced women of this area to be emancipated, to go to schools, to get education, to become more independent, to be more involved into the social life. It's time when the collective farms were formed in Dagestan, and they were also Jewish collective farms, mainly producing wines and bread and all different products. They were actually very successful. See, Mountain Jews historically had been involved into the agriculture, so their communal farms were they were among the most successful in the whole of Soviet Union. There was a special program to attract Mountain Jews as that indigenous, local tribe, to work in the factories, to get Soviet-style education. And we see that already by the late 1930s, the majority of Mountain Jews got their jobs in textile industry and different services. This is, for example, in the center, that's a photograph taken from in the Jewish theater in Derbent. So it was very interesting policy of Soviet Union towards different national minorities to support their culture, especially in 1920s and 30s. See, this is the photograph from the Jewish communal farm. It's Pesach Seder. And so they eat and drink, as it was written in the article in the newspaper, they eat and drink everything that they produce themselves. And making traditions. In Dagestan, according to the belief of mountain Jews, bread, first of all, it has to be man-made, but second, it has to be a round shape. Bread always has to be round. 1930s, there was new project, new ethnic identity. All people of Dagestan, there were many different ethnic groups, in fact, but Soviet government proclaimed that all people of Dagestan were one specific ethnic group. It was called Tat, and they all had the same language, Tat. Some of them historically were Muslims and some are Jews. So out of a sudden, Jews of Dagestan received completely new name. They became Tat, and that's exactly what was written in their passports. It helped in a way during the Second World War. See, during the war, Nazi Germany managed to occupy only a piece of Northern Caucasus. So they were only in the east and north of Caucasian Mountains. So Dagestan here in the east, it was not occupied. It was safe. So for example, in Derbent, Jews were safe, but there were two places occupied by Nazis. One was Jewish communal farm called Friendship, Druzhba, occupied in September 1942. And they were mainly mountain Jews who lived in that collective farm. All those who were there, who were not in the army, who were not somewhere else, men, women, and children, they were all murdered all by the end of September, numbering 470. These are originally the members of this communal farm. They were on the front, they were serving in the army. So that's the photograph taken near the monument. What's behind them, that's the memorial dedicated to the death of their relatives and neighbors. The story, another story, is about town Nalchik. It's the town in Russia, historically richly populated with Jews. There was a specific Jewish quarter in that town. So this town was also occupied by Nazis for over a year. But the absolute majority of Jews of Nalchik survived, and they survived thanks to this man. He's a Jew. His name is Markel Shabayev. He was a son of a tailor, and he was also a tailor. His father was famous for making unique fur hats. He was in the army. He served in the army. Before the army, he played in the theater. He had lots of artistic skills. He was head of the special Jewish propaganda theater. And so he served in the army. He had something, he needed to get something from another place. So he was going to a specific place. He had a duty to go there, get something, and return to his regiment. And he decided to visit his family. So he came to Nalchik to stay overnight, but when he woke up in the morning, the town was already occupied, the road was cut, he could not leave. Very fast, the Nazis spread around the town, quite like Russian administration. In the early 20th century, they couldn't distinguish Jews and non-Jews and no Jews. Everybody looked really the same. There was a Jewish officer who stayed in Markel Shabayev's house. And one day there was this advertisement that next morning Jews had to come to a specific location. We know that. We know the strategy. Markel Shabayev, he knew what was going to happen because he saw it already. He knew what Nazis were doing to Jews, and the officer who stayed in his house also told him in a friendly conversation that tomorrow Jews are going to be put together and then murdered. At night, Markel, together with his family, visited every single Jewish family in town, telling them not to come in the morning. The few Jews who came were all shot. Now then, they needed to do something. How you hide Jews? He went to speak to the government, local Muslim government that was formed by Nazis from local Muslims. He spoke to the head of this government, and they made a plan. They invited the ethnographer who made a testimony that people living in Nalchik are all Tat people. Some of them are Muslim. Some of them have some strange, funny religion that nobody understands, but they're all the same ethnic group. The Jewish part of the town was like transformed into the ethnographical museum. They dressed Jews in the traditional Muslim clothes. They had traditional Muslim foods. They managed to hide all the European furniture. Torah scrolls, together with all the sidurs, were covered and buried underground in the cemetery. So when the Nazis were invited on a tour, they were invited, they were treated, they were given food, they were made to believe that these were Tat people together with the other people of this town, just with some funny religion nobody understands. And it worked. Together with the testimony of the ethnographer, it worked. The town was occupied for a year, but not a single Jew aside of that first tiny group was murdered there. They survived thanks to this whole kind of a theatrical thing organized by Markel Shabayev, and thanks to the help of their neighbors, because they relied on their neighbors not to tell Nazis, oh, what are they talking about? They're Jews. We all know that. It's an interesting and unusual story, and it influenced Mountain Jews very much. So, and after the war, many Jews wanted to be named as Tat because they knew it helped other Jews survive the war. This is the photograph of 1957. The Jews from the kolkhoz, from collective farm, from Derbent in Moscow in 1957, honored, invited by the government to be honored for their unique achievements in the agriculture. Post-Second World War, we see fast emancipation of Mountain Jews. Their kids get education, they get new intellectual jobs. There's Soviet encyclopedia that mentions Tat ethnic group who practice Judaism. So out of a sudden, we have this new ethnicity in Soviet Union, Jewish Tat. And because you have Tat in your passport, not a Jew, then there are no limits for you. You can get to the university. The governmental anti-Semitism doesn't concern you. In late 1950s, we see that there were about 44, 45 Mountain Jews in Dagestan. Look at this family. See, it's the family of Mountain Jews. All these men and some of the women, they have proper jobs, they have proper education, but at home they still prefer traditional life, and Jewish tradition never died. They preserved much more of the Jewish tradition compared to, for example, Western regions of Soviet Union. This is the photograph of 1970s in Nalchik. Leather tanners pray in the yard of their workshop. Something you can't imagine in like Ukraine, where there was such a heavy suppression of the religion. Here, it was much easier. We keep speaking about Derbent, this unofficial capital of Mountain Jews, this old town built originally as a fort, and then the town was built from the fort down to the Caspian Sea. historical old town. Historically there was a Jewish quarter in Derbent. These are some the old photographs of it. You can see there's nothing fancy. It's very, very, very basic. Also, lots of Jews used to live in the villages around Derbent. And Jews had some shops, but not many, some houses. Many Jews of Derbent, they had gardens that they rented outside of the town so they could do some agriculture there. Because again, mountain Jews, their main economical activity was to do agriculture. The street used to be one of the central streets of the Jewish quarter. There is still some former Jewish homes preserved in the street, and this is the synagogue. It's new synagogue. It was built recently in 2009, replacing the old one, which existed here since the late 19th century. So here it's still all very, very, very new. It's being nicely taken care. It replaced this one, the old synagogue. It's called Kelenumaz. It just because it became too old, so they had to fully rebuild it. It's a pity they did not preserve the original design, but still nothing to do. There are some photographs from the Soviet times of mountain Jews coming to this synagogue, and some photographs of the modern times. So mountain Jews stay quite traditional wherever they are, in the United States, in Israel, in Russia. You see them going to the synagogue, you see them stuck to the traditions. Now there is Jewish life in Derbent. There is a school, there's kindergarten, all the elements of the traditional Jewish life. If you come, you find it in Derbent. This is interesting. You may think it's a Holocaust memorial because of the dates. It's not. It's a memorial dedicated to the mountain Jews who served in the Russian army during the Second World War, fighting against the Nazis, and died on the front. So it's the Jewish War memorial to the heroes of the Second World War. There are a couple of fun new sculptures in Derbent. These three men, it was a little sculpture presented to the town by a Jewish merchant. These are some very well-known Jews of Derbent. And there are three of them, and if you visit, you can come and step on these shoes and get photographed together with them. And this is something that modern Dagestan wants to underline and say, we are a place where everybody is welcomed. You have a Christian, you have a Muslim, and you have a Jew sitting together drinking tea. Some of the old Jewish homes were preserved in Derbent, like this one. What's unique about them, they all have some date of the construction on them. They're not in a very good condition anymore, and nearly nothing reminds us about Jews that used to live there. And again, that what I've mentioned, there's old Jewish cemetery, which really needs care, and there are fewer and fewer Jews who can provide care and preserve these old unique tombs. When you see a Hebrew and photograph, don't be surprised. You see it all around post-Soviet area. It's the Soviet tradition of putting the photograph on the tombstone, although it goes against the Jewish tradition. But Soviet people adopted lots of Soviet customs, new customs, something that everybody does it, so we do it as well. There's some portraits of the mountain Jews, some Jewish women. Mountain Jewish women love to be dressed beautifully, love to have nice makeup, love shawls, love dresses. You always see them dressed stylish and traditional at the same times. And there are lots of Jewish intellectuals. There are lots of singers and dancers, scholars and engineers among mountain Jews. Many of them made a very good career, both in Russia and in Israel and in the United States. I usually finish my talks with food. That's exactly what I'm going to do today. It's interesting. I told you that Purim is one of the major holidays because Mountain Jews sometimes think that they're descendants of Mordechai and Esther. This is a specific Purim dish. It's the thin bread and a pate made of dried fruit and raisins, and then you make like triangles and cover it and put it in, and then you can eat it. There are lots of specific traditions. For example, children make a figure of a man with in the morning, and then they hit this figure with a stone and hammer until the entire image is smoothed off the board. So they first carve it, and then they wanted to smash it because they just want, to crush Haman. One of the most typical thing about Gorsky cuisine, the cuisine of Mountain Jews, and there are lots of restaurants, for example, in New York, it's the meat, beef usually cooked with dried fruit, with plum or or apricots. So it's plus tomato sauce. So it's a sour and sweet. It can be with potatoes or rice. Also, rice with raisins and nuts is something very popular. This is a specific bread which is being cooked for Pesach. To make this bread, you only need flour and butter. And you can have it plain, or you can have cheese inside it. So, and again, if you're looking for Mountain Jewish communities, first of all, look for New York because there are large communities, or come to Israel and you'll find them in Ashdod, in Hadera, in many parts of our country. So thank you very, very, very much for your attention and your patience, and I'm here to answer your questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Evgenia. Amazing. How much knowledge. And also it's so interesting how each region that you have been talking about in your past series has a different history. And I don't know about different traditions. I don't know how different their traditions are, but they're not the same. It's all very different. So really, thank you. So yeah, I've got a few questions. So you answered about Mountain Jews living in Israel. My question is, like we learned in the past few sessions, that there's from Dagestan, there's from other areas in Israel. Do they also separate themselves in different communities, or Mountain Jews as a whole, they come together?
Mountain Jews, when they are, for example, in Israel, Mountain Jews of Dagestan and Azerbaijan would come together. They would get along with Bukhara Jews pretty well because of some similarities. They also don't mind to get along with other Mizrahi, so Eastern Jews. But honestly, they prefer, for example, to marry within the community. So the good choice for a Mountain Jewish boy would be to marry a Mountain Jewish girl. That's a choice approved by the parents.
I see. Okay, I've got a question here from Taibel or Table. I'm not sure I'm saying it correctly, and I'll try and understand it. He's asking about, or she's asking about, the Mountain Jews who were surrounded by Eastern Orthodox Christians. Were there in this area that you were talking about, or what was their impact? Was it different culture than the Muslims?
Okay, in this particular region, there was no Russian Orthodox Church up until early 19th century when Russian government came here. So absolute majority of customs and traditions of Mountain Jews, if they're not specifically Jewish, like if it's not like Pesach or Purim, but the everyday traditions, they were absorbed from the Muslims. For example, you want to marry. Here in this region, if a boy wants to marry a girl, he has to prepare some money and some things, some goods that he will pay. There is this bride price that he has to pay, or polygamy, or for example, the tradition of women living in a separate part of the house that men wouldn't go in. Or for example, the tradition of arranged marriages, when a man wouldn't talk to the father of the potential bride himself. He would ask, for example, his friends to talk to that man, and it can concern a girl who was just born. It doesn't matter. Up until late 19th century, they were incredibly early marriages. Girls got married very, very early. It was Russian government who started changing it, trying to stop this barbarian tradition. So main influence would be from the surrounding Muslim population. There is no specific influence of the Russian Orthodox Church here.
Okay, wow. One more question. Deb is asking, is there Chabad there? Is there a Chabad in Derbent?
Yes, sure.
Yes. Of course, right. Sure. So sure. The synagogue that you showed us is a Chabad synagogue?
It's Chabad, yes.
Okay. And also, can you give names of Gorski restaurants in New York? Can't find any searching online.
Oh, no,
Mary
I can Google, okay? Give me a second and I can Google, because I don't remember them by, I don't have them in like my memory. Yeah, I've been to New York quite a long time ago, where they promised to cancel visas for Israelis this autumn. As soon as they do it, we're going to the States. I'll be able to see the new restaurants.
Okay, so Evgenia, you can email them to me.
Sure.
And again,
I'll send you the email.
Yes. And again, I'm going to remind you that by tomorrow afternoon, I'll send you our notes about this talk with a few other links and things that Evgenia mentioned. So one more last question. I have a question here from Cantor Neil Schwartz. So he's talking about music. Are you familiar with Pris Eliyahu, who wrote the ethnological music?
Yes.
Familiar with him.
Yes.
Oh, and we can see here he's showing us the book, The Music of the Mountain Jews. So so it's being researched. I understand that their ethnic and the traditions and the music and food has all been researched. And I'll try and share as many links that I can find, or Evgenia can share with me, and send them out to you later on. Okay, I think we've come to an end. Thank you again for another fantastic program, Evgenia. We can't wait for another session. Thank you all for being with us. I hope you continue being part of our CSP community, and seeing you later on with future programs. Have a great rest of your day, and Laila Tov to you, Evgenia.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much.